Welcome to episode 4 of the Life in Norway show. Is Norway really the happiest place on earth? It's questions like this that I hope to answer as I interview other expats who live and work right here in Norway. The feedback on episode 3 about raising a child in Norway has been fantastic. Thank you so much to all of you who've been in touch to let me know how much you enjoyed the episode. If you're keen to hear more of the Life in Norway show, I have some good news for you. I'll be producing special Q&A podcasts all about living, working and travelling in Norway exclusively for Life in Norway supporters. I'll be back later in the show with more details. But first, today's interview. I'm joined by another American living in Norway. Dave Smith moved to Trondheim back in 2014 to be with his Norwegian girlfriend, now his wife, and set out on an interesting journey to find a job and integrate into Norwegian lifestyle. He now works as the head of marketing for a Trondheim-based sales technology company, Dogu, and runs his own podcast called The Art of Sales. On this episode of the Life in Norway show, we have a conversation about working culture in Norway. Come with me as we step inside a Norwegian office. Happy listening. I'm very pleased to welcome Dave Smith to the Life in Norway show. Dave, welcome.
Thanks, Dave. Nice to be here.
So you're a former US Marine, a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley. You've been in Norway since, around 2014. Is that right?
December 2014, yeah.
Why don't you start by telling us your story, because you've got quite an interesting background and what brought you to Norway.
Yeah, sure. So after serving in the Marines, I went to college at UC Berkeley, and I met a girl while I was there, fell in love, and eventually came to Norway to be with her. I've been here for almost 3 years now, and we're married as of August, so all works out.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Now, I've seen from your Facebook and Instagram accounts, you seem to have embraced Norwegian lifestyle, the outdoor lifestyle. You're an avid backpacker. You like to hike most weekends, it seems. Is that fair to say that Norway and the Norwegian lifestyle suits you?
Oh yeah, it fits me like a glove. Even in the US, I was always out in nature every chance that I got. Here it's much closer and more available, I feel. So it's been great here.
So we had a coffee shortly after you arrived here in Trondheim, and you were asking for a few tips about finding a job. That's something I always advise people to do when they first arrive in Norway, is to seek out a network, seek out people who can show them the way. I'm not sure I showed you the way exactly, but what that meeting did do is it led to you writing some articles for Life in Norway. One of which, while you were still looking for a job, was called Working Culture in Norway. What I'd like to do today is return to that post, and now you've been working for the best part of 3 years, see what's changed, what you've learned, if the principles you talked about in that post are still accurate. So why don't you tell us what you do first of all?
Sure. I'm a chief marketing officer for a software startup company. We build data visualization and sales motivation solutions for companies around the globe.
And how did you end up in such a role?
Well, that's an interesting story in and of itself. I was having a pretty hard time finding work here, and eventually used networking, as you mentioned, to try and connect with as many people as possible. And eventually I met enough people that I managed to get into a newspaper article that had a little bit about myself and the difficulty that I was having finding a job. And sure enough, the phone started ringing shortly thereafter.
That's terrific. So where you're working at the moment, it's a fairly small company, but growing rapidly. Would that be fair to say?
Definitely fair to say. So right now we're at about a little over 20 employees and really gaining traction fast. We've probably doubled our revenues at least year over year, and looking to do close to the same this year. Of course, it gets harder to double revenues the further into it you get, but we set pretty lofty goals and we work really hard.
Sure. That's great. So looking back at the post, the original post, Working Culture in Norway, we'll link to that in the show notes so people can go read it and get some context about what we're talking about. You spoke about things unique to Norway, or certainly with more of a priority here in Norway as opposed to the US, and I think a lot of this applies to the UK and other countries as well. Some of those things were the priority of education, the importance of punctuality, job security here, equality, and that's equality in terms of gender, in terms of salaries, and so on. The work-life balance. Which of these, now you've been in the working ecosystem for some time, do you think are the most prominent differences?
I would say perhaps the work-life balance and the across-the-board income equality, of course. So many countries, of course, are working towards equality across all aspects and things like that. And each has a slightly different approach, but it's common pretty much everywhere. I would say that the work-life balance here is really nice. It's nice to have a solid 8-hour day. It's very uncommon to see even a CEO in the office past 4 or 5 p.m. There's a huge emphasis on family, a huge emphasis on focusing on what really matters in life. And I think that here in Norway, it's a work to live and not a live to work culture. And that means a lot. And of course, in the US, it depends on where you go. The US is a huge country, and you can find all sorts of different values and approaches to work. But I do think that too often in the US, it tends to become a live to work where people are sacrificing personal happiness and family time and other such things in order to put food on the table or make lots of money or whatever the case happens to be.
Sure, I fully agree that that's certainly the case here in Norway. When I first moved here to Oslo back in 2011, the business where I won't name names now, but we actually worked with an American client here in Norway, and there was, to put it mildly, a culture clash. There was an expectation that a meeting at 5 o'clock on a Friday was absolutely fine and that people would work over the weekend if they needed to. And it caused a lot of problems, not just day to day, but strategically on the project as well. How do you think that sort of problem can be managed? Because more and more now we see American companies and Norwegian companies working together in the startup world and even at the highest level of the energy industry.
It's definitely a common problem. In fact, I was at a wedding recently and talking with some friends from Switzerland who have a very similar kind of work-life balance. And they contract for a U.S. company and had very similar issue. And I think that it's really important to remember that the culture itself of the country where you're doing business is that way for a reason. You can't really just come in and shape and change culture in a different place. I think it's also very important that both sides take into consideration some of the factors, such as, okay, so, say we don't have a meeting on Friday at 5 p.m. Does it really hurt anything? Say we let people focus more on free time and on quality time with family and on whatever other endeavors they have. Does it really hurt anything? And then, of course, if companies are doing business with the U.S., they do need to understand that the U.S. is a very kind of head down, just drive forward kind of culture. Will tackle anything in their paths to get the job done. And in a lot of ways, that's great. That is kind of what built the U.S., that forward, drive through it mentality. And that some of those things, working through the weekend when it's necessary, can be very important. But without a doubt, as we continue to move forward towards a more global economy and workplace, the cultures are going to have to come together and kind of understand that the culture in the country is the driving factor. You can't really change that. People here in Norway are not gonna, work overtime on the weekends. It's just not that kind of culture, and I don't think that's gonna change.
Do you think that this sort of culture here in Norway will actually prevent, let's say some major startups from succeeding here? Is the likelihood of, let's say, a Google or an Apple or a Facebook being born here in Scandinavia much lower? Could a company like that only be born in the US, where people are prepared to go the extra mile and to work around the clock and so on?
That is a very good question. The answer, however, is no, I don't think so. Now, of course, with a startup, there are different levels. Is it an initial startup with, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 employees? Or is it a somewhat established startup with, 10, 15, 20 employees? Or is it starting to become somewhat mid-range startup with more? A lot of that will matter significantly because, of course, if you are the founders of a company and you come in and you're trying to get the ball rolling, you're trying to create a product or raise capital or whatever, I don't care if it's Norway, the US, or any other country in the world, you are going to be working well upwards of 12, 16-hour days. That is just startup life. That's what it takes to start a business. Now, down the road, 2, 3 years into it, if you're lucky, then maybe you can kind of have a more balanced workforce and work-life balance and those sort of things. But I think pretty much anywhere, starting a company, if you're really serious about it and if you want to be successful in a competitive global market, you're going to have to put in a significant amount of hours, well above and beyond the 8-hour days, no matter where you're at.
Great stuff. Sounds good. We'll be right back after this short break where we'll talk more about what it's like to be in a Norwegian office day to day. This episode of the Life in Norway show is supported by listeners just like you. If you're enjoying these interviews, please consider supporting the show from just $2 a month. That's around 16 Norwegian kroner, less than a simple black coffee here in Norway. Not only will your support guarantee the future of the show, supporters get access to exclusive Q&A podcasts where you can ask any question about Norway and I'll do my very best to answer it. You'll also get massive discounts on all the ebooks we've produced and will produce in the future. To support the Life in Norway show from just $2 a month, visit patreon.com/lifeinnorway. That's patreon.com/Life in Norway. Thank you so much for your support. Okay, we're back here on the Life in Norway show with Dave Smith. He's Chief Marketing Officer at Dogu, and we're talking about working culture in Norway. Dave, that was some really interesting stuff we've just been speaking about in terms of working culture differences between the US and Norway. If a big corporate came knocking, whether it was here in Norway or maybe even back in the States, would you ditch startup life here in Norway for the lure of a paycheck that's 3 or 4 times the size?
That is a good question. So I've always been a firm believer that money can't buy happiness. Of course, money's great, right? You need money to buy a house and to get along. And Norway is not an inexpensive country to live in by any means. But I think that for myself personally, it's very important to be able to focus on the things that are most important. For instance, I bike to and from work every day. Snow, rain, you name it. And it's not always as fun as it may sound, but it is beautiful. Like, I love that I'm out and active on my way to work. I'm not sitting in several hours of traffic. When I lived in Los Angeles, I lived a 15-minute drive away from the office that I worked at. However, on an average day, it took me an hour to get to work. And if there was a traffic accident, it took me 2 hours. And that's each way. So there are a lot of things that I think when you slow down and you look at the bigger picture, I consider myself incredibly lucky to be able to bike to work, to be able to spend so much quality time with friends and family. And I would be very hard pressed to trade flexibility and time in exchange for a big salary.
Great stuff. Now, I want to pick up on something you said towards the beginning of that answer, which was about the cost of living here. Now, you're working for a startup. Salaries are obviously going to be a little bit lower in a startup. And that brings me on to gender equality, because it's extremely normal here in Norway for both parts of a couple to work full time. That's the case with you and your wife, I believe.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and there's plenty of women working at Dogu and working in the startup scene through Trondheim. Is there anything else around this aspect of having more women in the workplace here that is worth discussing?
Yeah, I would say that we're fully, of course, equal opportunity employer. We have a handful of women who work for us who are absolutely phenomenal at what they do. And in many cases, they bring something to the table that men may not always have. Our graphic designer has an eye that just, she catches things that would escape me. Oh, you know, the colors or the design of things or whatever. And she's phenomenal at what she does. We have a customer success manager who works very closely with our customers. And she builds such great relationships with the customers that it's easy for them to see the value in our product, understand exactly how it works, and stick with us. And same, we have a key account manager who's also a woman. And she's phenomenal at what she does. Large account holders are more than happy with the services provided. And I think that it's really nice. As with anything, you have to have a balance, you know. If we were an office of just all guys, our design wouldn't be nearly what it is today. Our approach in terms of customer centricity would not be what it is today. There's just many things that they bring to the table and really round us out in a really nice way.
So returning to the original post you wrote a few years ago, one of the aspects of working culture in Norway that you wrote about was the casual nature of the workplace here. Now, you're sitting here today in t-shirt and shorts, heading off to the office once we finish recording. Is it fair to say that it's a very casual place to work?
In fact, I may be too casual for our office. I get jokes all the time about when am I actually going to put pants on, you know. To me, I do primarily digital marketing. I go to the gym and I'm training and everything before work. And a lot of times I stay in shorts and a t-shirt because I can get away with it, you know. But of course, I should at least, you know, I always have spare change of clothes and everything like that, and should have jeans on. But the casual workplace is nice. I think that there's a lot about creativity and focus that comes from a casual workplace. Now, it doesn't have to necessarily be shorts and a t-shirt at the desk, right? But I think that it's really nice to work in a place where you can be yourself. You are more concerned about the work that you do than the clothing that you wear. A lot of places in the U.S. are kind of very formal, of course. You know, you go to a JP Morgan Chase or Morgan Stanley or a large banking institution or whatever, you're going to see lots of suits and ties, and there's nothing wrong with that. And those folks are plenty good at what they do. But I also think that it makes sense in a lot of industries to be casual and just relaxed and straightforward. Sure. I think it helps a lot with the productivity in the workplace.
Sure. I mean, for me, it goes further than the clothing. There's a relaxed approach to meetings. There's a relaxed approach to what time you arrive, what time you leave. We've touched on that already. I'm a freelancer now, but my days of employment when I first arrived in Norway, one of the overriding memories is of people leaving to go and pick up their sick kids from school, or they had a dental appointment, or even a hairdresser's appointment on a Friday afternoon before a weekend away. And whilst you can't do this kind of thing all the time, it's generally accepted that once in a while that's okay, because everyone has these needs, and it goes around in a circle. Is that the same at Dogu?
Yeah, we have a very, very, very strong understanding that as long as you're on task getting your work done and meeting or ideally exceeding your goals, you have a very large range of flexibility in terms of, whether you want to go pick up your kids early from school or do whatever. If you're on task, that's okay. I know that there's been a lot of talk about the idea of an 8-hour workday and how important it is for an 8-hour workday. And that depends. I mean, do you work for a company that you love, that you don't mind being there, you don't feel suffocated, and therefore you put forward a solid 7 or 8 hours worth of work in that 8-hour workday, as opposed to tons and tons of people who work for companies, work an 8-hour workday, but really put forward an hour and a half, 2 hours, come in, check email, have a smoke break, go out, walk around the building, come back in, do something else. And so I'm not an expert in terms of the ability to speak on the correlation between length of a workday and total productivity, but I think it's not so much about the number of hours. It's of course more about what you put into those hours. And people who feel respected and motivated within their work are going to be more on task and will get stuff done. I think it just makes a lot of sense.
You bring up productivity. It's an interesting point because just recently there was a survey released. I'll try and find the link for the show notes, that put Norway at number 1, the most productive country in Europe. I'm not sure how it compared to the US. I'll have to go back and take a look. But it did sort of surprise me because you have a short working week here. You have almost an entire month in the summer, July, when the offices are empty. And yet productivity still seems to happen. Work still seems to get done. So the only conclusion I could draw is when I used to spend 40 plus hours in an office, there was a lot of email. There was a lot of meaningless meetings where actions and decisions weren't taken. There was meetings to talk about the need for another meeting where a decision would be taken. There's also the fact that here in Norway, we have a much flatter hierarchy in businesses than in most other countries that I've come across. So yes, there'll be someone in charge, but then there's very few levels of reporting. People have their task, they go away and do it. There's some trust there. So maybe there's less of this email culture, less of this meeting culture. Does any of that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of what you're talking about really points towards efficiency. So as I said, it's not necessarily how many hours you spend, it's how efficient are you with the hours that you spend. And when you have these rigid, structured hierarchies, it looks like a pyramid, then of course everything has to work its way to the top and then trickle back down, and there's bureaucracy and red tape and other stuff. And I've worked for some very, very, very large companies, and that was definitely the case. And I find that when you have more of a horizontal leadership structure, flat across the board, it's much easier and quicker to get stuff done. And I think that if you hire people that you trust, and you trust them to make decisions, and you enable them to get stuff done, it's much more efficient than micromanaging. Nobody likes to be micromanaged. If you want to burn out an employee, the fastest way to do it is to micromanage them. So I think there's a lot to be said for the efficiency of these horizontal leadership structures and the way that a lot of that stuff goes. And it does make sense that you'll have more efficient and higher performing teams when you give them the reins, say, hey, I trust you, here's your endpoint, ready, set, go.
Sure. So this has all been pretty positive so far about the experience of working in Norway. Bearing in mind some of your colleagues may well be listening to this show, is there anything that you find frustrating, not necessarily a negative thing, but something that's frustrating about the working life here?
Yeah, there definitely are some frustrating things. I would say that, of course, in the US and as well in the UK, when you send an email, you expect a response within an hour or a couple of hours, or at least within a day or two,
Sure.
Or when you call someone on the telephone and you have an issue with a product or you have an issue with whatever it happens to be, you kind of expect a very straightforward response, get it fixed, okay, it's taken care of, and done with it. And here, I mean, a lot of these offices, God help you if you try and call anyone past 2 p.m. on a Friday. or past 3 or 4 p.m. on a regular weekday, or if you're working a full day and you're trying to sort something with the bank or the post office or the whoever else, and they're on the same schedule as you are, right? It can be very frustrating. And then a lot of times, what comes with this very relaxed and casual culture is, of course, a relaxed and casual approach to the workplace, which is not necessarily bad. As I said, you don't want people frightened all the time or afraid of getting fired or whatever. But at the same time, I think that a lot of times you do run into people who are less focused on customer happiness or on whatever it happens to be than they should be, and that without a doubt gets frustrating. One time ever, I was on the phone with somebody and I was trying to sort an issue, and they didn't really have answers for me. And I said, "Okay, can I speak to a manager or someone? Like, can you connect me to someone? The next pay grade up?" And there was kind of an awkward silence, and I got put on hold. And I was on hold for about 3 minutes, and then the phone hung up. And I went and I told my coworkers, and I was like, "Gosh, I was just trying to fix this issue, And they hung up on me. They said, "Well, what did you say?" I said, "Well, I asked to speak to a manager." And they're like, "Oh, we don't do that here. You don't ask to speak to someone's manager here. That may work in other countries. Here, absolutely not." And that was kind of a wake up call to me. It was like, okay, that's definitely different.
Customer service is certainly, I could probably do a whole podcast alone on the issues around customer service in Norway. But I think one of the tips that people are often given when learning a language is to go out and use that language in shops,
Yes.
in restaurants, and so on, any service industry role, because generally people who work in the service industry are outgoing, they're chatty, they're being paid to engage with you, so it's a great opportunity to practice the language. I would say that's not quite the same here. If you are in a supermarket, you can maybe get by with 2 or 3 words. And if you actually actively ask a question, then maybe you get either the classic Norwegian shrug back or a stare. It's very difficult to engage in conversation in the service industry. And that for me was a remarkable discovery when I moved here.
Less is more in terms of conversation.
Absolutely.
Less
absolutely.
is more. You can say a lot with just simple noise or whatever. But I would also say that when you're contacting, whether it's an organization or a business or whatever else, what I do now every single time is, of course, I'm always polite, regardless of where I'm calling customer service. But I start off in Norwegian. I take the conversation as far as I possibly can in Norwegian, and then if I need to, I say, "I'm sorry, can we switch to English?" And then usually it's, "Yeah, I think we can manage that." And then the conversation ensues in perfect English. But I think that showing that you're invested in the culture here, that you're putting forth the effort first, that you're not just some foreigner demanding that other people listen to you because whatever. I think it goes a long way. And of course, if you have the possibility, a lot of times, I'll try once or twice and I'll put Katrina on the phone, and she's just so extremely, incredibly pleasant and nice and such a pleasure to talk to, and fluent Norwegian and everything, that a lot of times when I'll get no's time after time to a question, I'll put her on the phone, and it's literally solved instantly. I'm
The
like, okay.
benefits of being married to somebody who works in HR, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay, I won't put you on the spot and ask about any more negatives or downsides. I think we've covered enough there. Something that I don't want to go into too much detail today, because I'd love to have you back on the show another time to talk about your tips for finding a job in Norway, which is possibly the number one question I get on email from the website. But maybe you could give us a top tip or 1 or 2 tips for someone who's job hunting right now, or that's somebody who is maybe living in the States or in the UK thinking about coming to Norway. What problems will they face in job hunting?
My very first tip would be aware ahead of time that it is can be incredibly difficult to find work here. I run into people all the time. They're like, "Oh yeah, I'm just going to quit my job and move my family across and live in Norway because I want to live in Norway." And I'm like, right, that is a terrible financial decision. you will have to out of pocket for housing. The food is expensive, transportation is expensive. There are other logistical costs, so many things. And then in addition to that, you ideally need to have a grasp on the language. Now, in terms of language, it is actually, from my understanding, harder to get an entry-level job than it is to get a sort of mid-management level job. The reason being, the most entry-level jobs are direct customer-facing. So if I wanted to work selling phone subscriptions, or work in an outbound call center, or work in literally any public-facing sector, it would be very difficult for me not speaking the language. You can't have someone walk into a shop and start asking you questions about buying a Samsung phone, and you say, "No, I'm sorry, can we speak English?"
Sure.
It just doesn't work that way. So it definitely compounds the difficulty that finding the foot in the door entry-level jobs is actually more difficult. Now, of course, a lot of the mid-level management jobs are more interactions within the organization, et cetera, where you can be a little bit more flexible with learning the language, et cetera. And then I think the last tip, of course, is networking. I don't know if I've ever had a job in my life that I didn't network my way into. And it's just kind of the way that it goes. It's all about who you know, and coming here like I did with meeting you, right? Introducing myself, saying, not just networking to say, "Hi, I'm Dave and I'm an American and I'm here," because that doesn't do you any good, but "Hi, I'm here, I'm a foreigner and I really want to stay here, and I'm trying to find whatever I can do to help other people, to show that I'm useful, to show that I'm a good worker, to show that I'm effective, and hopefully down the road there will be some form of trickle back in terms of people in the community who have heard that I'm a decent person and may know someone who would like to hire me." And I think that goes a really long way. But as with most things in life, you really have to dig in and give, and hope that something works out.
Yeah, absolutely. The first time we met, that's something I do remember. You had obviously asked questions of people before, you'd taken their advice on board and were then acting on it. And it's amazing the number of people who get in touch with me and with other people I know here in Trondheim who are after jobs, and they have a coffee with me or whatever. They listen to the advice, and then they're back in 3 months asking the same questions, and they just haven't gone and acted on that advice. The biggest mistake I think people make is when I say, "What is it you want to do?" They put their hands up and they'll say, "I'll do anything." And that's a problem, because as you say, working in a cafe, working in a shop, working in a restaurant, it really does need Norwegian. There are a couple of job opportunities, let's say working in a kitchen, where maybe you can get by with English, but again, you'll be expected to pick up Norwegian straight away. Anyway, let's not dwell on finding a job. We're talking about working culture. Before we move on to the final questions, Dave, is there anything that from the last 3 years you've learned you didn't know at the beginning when you moved here that has surprised you about working life here?
Yeah, so when I initially moved here, I wasn't aware of the amount of vacation days, or of the maternity, paternity leave, or
And
of
that's
any
a
of
lot
these.
for anyone who's listening.
Yeah,
And doesn't
exactly.
know.
It's a significant amount. It's 25 days a year by law, and that's, of course, had zero factor whatsoever in why I was moving here. I didn't know anything about that. Um, but a lot of times I do question this myself in terms of, okay, so it's lovely to have 25 or more vacation days a year where you can get the stuff done that you need to get done, etc. And so Katrina and I got married in August, and we had folks come from the U.S. and we're like, "Yeah, come stay with us for a week or two. We'll hike the mountains, we'll climb, we'll catch fish, we'll bike, we'll everything." And a lot of these folks who are coming in came and, close family, and they stayed for 2 or 3 days, and then they had to go right back to work.
Wow.
And that got me thinking a lot about, does it make a difference in terms of productivity? If you give someone an additional 10 days of vacation a year or whatever, does it actually result in reduced productivity? Because I feel like a lot of times people go on a 3 or 4 day vacation and they come back, but they're still burnt out. It didn't solve anything. And a lot of times they're still answering emails or trying to solve issues or whatever else while they're on so-called vacation, depending on what companies they work for. And I am a really, really firm believer that people are the backbone of any organization. They are the foundation of what you do. And so if you treat your people well and you give them sufficient amount of vacation or of flexibility or of whatever else, then you will have people who are more fit and more ready and more able to complete the tasks that you set for them. Now, the same with maternal and parental leave. It is, I'll say this straightforward, it is ridiculous to me that in the US and other countries, that women are expected to give birth and then oftentimes return again to the workplace within 2 weeks or a month or even a month and a half. And that's mind-blowing. And not only that, but I don't think it's required by law anywhere in the US to have paid parental leave. And so they'll work up until it's time to give the baby. Now, I've never been pregnant, so I can't even begin to imagine how stressful that must be, but it can't be good for the child, you know? And I think that there's a lot of these things that make a lot of sense that hopefully we'll start to see implemented in other cultures around the world. Now, I completely understand that it's not comparing apples and apples to compare the US and Norway or the UK and Norway or anywhere else. And I understand that there are huge implications in terms of tax burden and in terms of how you actually support it and everything else. And that it's unlikely that the US, for instance, will ever have 8 months paid maternal leave. It's highly unlikely. However, I'm very confident in saying that there does need to be a better solution. If you care about your workers and if you care about your women in the workforce and you want to have them have strong, happy, healthy families, then it's very important to give them time off to take care of the most important thing in life, right? So some of this, it kind of boggles my mind a little bit. I'm very blessed and lucky to be part of the system that we have here. It's opened my eyes in many ways. And I do think that there's a lot that can be learned or at least taken into consideration about the way that the Nordic countries look at their workforce and structure the flexibility, time off, and other things.
But this is something that you've only thought about since moving here. Perhaps when you were still in the US, the paternity leave issue, the days off from work, it was just seen as normal.
Well, sort of. When I was born, my mom took off work for X number of years, probably 2-3 years or more. And the family just made it work. Now, it wasn't a good income by any stretch of the imagination. My father was a middle school teacher and mom not working, so things were tight. But I do think that if at all possible, just remembering that employees are not just workhorses. They should be more like family than like slave labor, I guess. You should take care of the people who work for you. You should be vested in their best interest. And if you do that, I guarantee you'll build an organization full of people who care as much about you as you do about them, who are putting forth 100% effort instead of being burnt out and putting forth 60%. If you ever look at the engagement rate statistics like across the US, it's mind-blowing. It's barely a fraction of the workforce is actually engaged in what they do. And there's a lot of things that can change. You can tweak little things here and there in order to have a more effective and more efficient workforce. And I hope that starts to take place.
Dave, we could probably sit here for the rest of the day talking about this. I hope you'll return, talk about some of these topics again. But before you go, I have 3 quick questions for you. Quick answers, please.
Yep.
Best thing about living in Norway?
Nature.
Most challenging thing about living in Norway?
The weather.
And finally, where is your favourite place in Norway? The place where you stand and think, this is it.
Gotcha. My favorite place in Norway is in the Romsdal Alps on the west coast of Norway. It's beautiful mountains, incredible scenery. It's a fantastic place for skiing, biking, hiking, climbing, or any other outdoor activities, which is, of course, what I put a very high value on.
Sure. You write the odd article for Life in Norway under the expat blogs section. Your blog is called A New Life in Trondheim. There's some really interesting articles there, mainly written during the time that you moved here and were looking for a job. But I highly recommend people go read those if they want to hear a bit more from you. If someone wants to maybe reach out, get in touch with you, or learn a little bit more about the company you work for, where should they go?
Yeah, they can visit our company website at Dogu, spelled DOGU.io. There, if you have a really strong desire to get in contact with me, I'm sure that you are clever and can sort out how to get in contact with me. I'm not going to put my contact information all over the web right now. However, I do have a lot of times people who come in and want to grab a coffee and want to chat. They're here to pursue love or for whatever reason. And yes, absolutely, I will set aside time to meet and to have a chat and to see how we can sort it, because this has been one of the best decisions that I've ever made. As I said, I'm recently married. I love my life here, and I wish others the same good fortune as well, and I hope I can help you in that endeavor.
Fantastic stuff, Dave. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Dave.